Sometimes, a single night changes everything, not because of what you lose, but because of what you find. I was just a maid, used to cleaning up after other people's chaos. But that night, the chaos found me. A stranger, bleeding in my bed. A gun on the floor. And a choice that would cost me the rest of my peace. This isn't a love story. It's a story about mercy, fear, and the kind of silence that can save or destroy a person. The night it rained inside, I didn't know his name, or what kind of danger I was pulling into my world. I only knew one thing. I couldn't let him die. If you're someone who believes real change begins in quiet moments, stay with me. Because this story isn't about heroes or villains. It's about two broken souls who crossed paths when the world stopped listening. And before you leave, make sure to subscribe. Because every week, I share another story that reminds us, sometimes, even in the darkest nights, we still choose to help. I remember that night because the rain wouldn't stop. It didn't sound like weather anymore. It sounded like something breaking open. The kind of storm that finds its way through roofs and walls and ribs, until you can't tell if the leaking is outside or inside you. I was wiping down the hallway floors of the old Hillrest estate, counting the hours until dawn. The family had gone to Europe for the season, which meant the house belonged to me and the silence. I liked it that way. Silence doesn't ask questions. It doesn't look at you the way people do when they realize you're just the maid who never left. When the lights flickered, I thought nothing of it. Old houses breathe that way. But then I heard it, a low sound, not thunder, not wind. It was a breath. Ragged, wet. Coming from my room. My first thought was that someone had broken in. My second was that maybe I didn't care enough to be scared. I stood outside my door for a long minute, listening. The storm outside was loud enough to hide anything. Still, something in me knew, whatever waited inside wasn't supposed to be there. When I opened the door, I saw him. A man lay across my bed, half conscious, blood soaking through my sheets. His shirt was torn open, and under the yellow lamp his skin looked pale, almost grey. There was a gun on the floor beside him. For a second, the world narrowed to that. Blood, metal, breath. I should have run. That would have made sense. But instead, I just stood there, staring. His eyes flickered open for a second, dark, unfocused, but sharp enough to find mine. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. I saw it in his face. Pain, anger, exhaustion, like someone who'd been running for too long. I don't know why I moved closer. Maybe it was habit. Maybe pity. Maybe both. I found an old towel in the drawer and pressed it against the wound on his side. He groaned, low and animal, but didn't push me away. The blood was warm and thick. I'd seen enough of it once before, when my father came home from the factory with his hand torn open. I was 16 then. I didn't scream that time either. Some people just don't. Don't die here, I whispered before I realized I'd said it. My voice sounded strange, like someone else's. He blinked once, slow. Then his eyes rolled shut again. For a while, I just sat there, counting the rise and fall of his chest. I didn't even think about who he might be or why he was bleeding in a stranger's room. I just wanted him to keep breathing. Maybe because if he stopped, I'd have to face what it meant, that I'd been alone all along, and even this strange interruption had left me again. When the power went out, the room went black except for the lightning flashing through the curtains. Each strike lit him in fragments, jaw, scar, wrist. There was a tattoo under the blood, faint but deliberate. I didn't recognize it then, but I felt the wrongness of it. Like something marked. I worked by touch. Found a needle, thread, and the small bottle of whiskey the gardener left behind weeks ago. I cleaned the wound the way I remembered from training, back when I wanted to be a nurse. Back before I dropped out because rent came first. My hands shook, but they kept moving. There's a strange peace that comes with survival work. You don't think. You just do. When I finished, I sat on the floor beside the bed, my back against the wall. The rain had softened outside, but inside it still felt heavy. I watched the blood dry on my hands until it turned dark. I should have called someone, police, ambulance, anyone. But I knew what would happen if I did. They'd ask why I helped him. I wouldn't have an answer that made sense. I pulled the curtains tighter and waited for dawn. Every few minutes, he'd shift, breathing hard, muttering words I couldn't catch. Once, he said a name, Luca. I thought it was a person. Maybe someone he wanted to see before dying. Around 3 in the morning, I heard footsteps outside, quick and deliberate, crunching through gravel. I froze. The sound passed, then disappeared into the rain. I turned off the lamp and held my breath. He didn't wake. I think that's when it hit me, whatever he was running from might still be out there. By the time the sky began to pale, his breathing had steadied. I replaced the towel with a clean sheet and sat beside him until the clock struck 6. My shift was supposed to start then, but nothing about that morning followed rules anymore. When he finally opened his eyes again, they were clear. Alert. He looked at me for a long second before whispering, "Why didn't you call anyone?" I didn't answer. I just said, "You should rest." He closed his eyes again, and I knew everything had changed. I just didn't know how much yet. That night, the rain didn't stop at the door. It had found its way inside me too. Morning came slowly, as if unsure it was welcome. The storm had passed, but the house still smelled like wet wood and old secrets. I sat at the edge of the bed, watching him breathe. The blood was gone from his skin, but the danger hadn't left the room. It clung to him, like smoke that had nowhere else to go. He hadn't moved much since the night before. His wound was deep, but not fatal. I had seen enough of both to know the difference. The towel I'd pressed against him was now stiff and brown, a reminder of the choice I made without thinking. For the first few hours, I told myself he'd wake up, walk out, and disappear from my life. That's what I wanted. That's what made sense. But he stayed. When he finally opened his eyes again, the light caught them just right, dark, almost black, but steady. He didn't look confused or afraid. He looked like a man who had accepted worse things than this. "You're still here," he said quietly. His voice was rough, low, the kind that carried authority even when it didn't mean to. "So are you," I answered. He tried to sit up but stopped halfway, clutching his side. I handed him a glass of water and said nothing. He drank slowly, his hand trembling slightly. There was a long silence between us, the kind that stretches until it starts to mean something. He glanced around the room, taking in the plain walls, the cracked dresser, the uniform hanging behind the door. Then his eyes returned to me. "Where am I?" "Hillrest Estate," I said. "You broke into a maid's room." A faint smirk crossed his face, the first sign of something human. Then I should thank her for not throwing me out. I didn't answer. Gratitude sounded foreign in his mouth. I kept my hands busy, changing the bandage, refilling the basin, pretending none of this felt strange. But it did. Every second did. By afternoon, he could stand. Barely. He leaned on the dresser, catching his breath. I noticed how he moved, deliberate, calculated, like a man who'd been trained to survive pain. Every step was quiet, efficient, controlled. He looked out the window, scanning the grounds with the instinct of someone who had spent years being hunted. Then he turned back to me and asked, "Did anyone come here last night?" I hesitated. "No one who stayed." He nodded once, as if that was all he needed. "If they ask, you didn't see me." The words came out like an order, but something in his tone stopped short of threat. It was more weary. I recognized it. That exhaustion people carry when they've been on the run too long. "You think I want people to know?" I said quietly. For the first time, he looked at me properly, not just as the person who patched him up, but as someone capable of her own choices. The corner of his mouth twitched. Not a smile, not really. More like acknowledgement. After that, the silence became part of the room. I worked around him. Cleaned the hallway, mended curtains, prepared simple meals. He stayed in the shadows, resting, watching. Sometimes I caught him staring at the rain stains on the ceiling, lost in thought. At night, the thunder was gone, but I could still hear something in the walls, the echo of last night's fear. I tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't quiet. Every sound felt amplified, a floorboard creak, the hum of the refrigerator, his soft breathing from the other side of the room. I thought about calling someone again, maybe the police, maybe no one in particular, just to hand this responsibility over to anyone else. But then I remembered the look in his eyes when he asked me not to. There was a kind of trust there, fragile and undeserved. And somehow, I couldn't break it. The next morning, I brought him tea. He thanked me without looking up. His voice was softer now, stripped of command. "You didn't have to do this," he said. I know. He studied me for a moment, as if trying to read the reason behind what I'd done. People don't help strangers anymore. I'm not people, I said simply. He let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, and looked away. The sunlight caught his face, revealing the lines of someone who'd seen too much, survived too long. He wasn't young. Not old either. Just worn down by a world that never stopped taking. By the third day, he could move more freely. He shaved, borrowed one of the estate owner's coats, and asked if there was a back exit. I pointed toward the servants' corridor. He didn't leave right away. Instead, he stood in the doorway for a long moment. If anyone comes asking, he said, "You never saw me." I didn't, I replied. He looked at me one last time, not with gratitude, not with apology, just a quiet understanding that neither of us would forget this. Then he left. The room felt heavier after he was gone. I changed the sheets again, scrubbed the floor until my hands ached, but his presence lingered, in the faint smell of whiskey and metal, in the silence that followed. That night, I realized something strange. The storm had ended, but the weight hadn't lifted. It had simply moved inside me, quiet, patient, waiting for what would come next. 3 days after he left, the house finally started to breathe again. The floors creaked like old bones stretching, and the morning light returned to its usual color, soft, filtered through the dust I could never quite wipe away. But inside me, something stayed unsettled. Every time the wind moved the curtains, I expected to see him there again, standing by the dresser, half in shadow, watching the world like it owed him an explanation. I told myself it was relief I felt. Relief that he was gone, that whatever trouble followed him hadn't found me. But the truth was heavier than that. The truth was that silence had grown louder without him in it. I went back to work like nothing had changed. Polishing silverware that didn't belong to me. Making beds no one thanked me for. Smiling politely at guests who never learned my name. But I noticed things now, the way people avoided eye contact when they lied, the way footsteps revealed fear more than words ever could. That night, while locking up the servants' corridor, I saw a flicker of movement near the tree line. My chest tightened before my mind caught up. For a moment, I thought it was him, the same dark coat, the same deliberate stillness. But when I looked again, there was nothing. Just wind moving through the trees. I closed the door, locked it twice, and told myself ghosts don't wear boots. The next evening, a note appeared under my door. No name. No signature. Just 3 words written in a hurried, almost desperate hand. They know. Leave. I read it over and over until the letters blurred. My first thought was that it had to be him, Luca. I didn't know why I was sure, but I was. He hadn't struck me as the kind of man who ran without reason. If he said leave, then something was coming. But where would I go? I'd lived here 6 years, hidden behind routine and other people's lives. The idea of leaving without knowing where to land felt impossible. Still, I packed a small bag. Just in case. The next morning, the estate was louder than usual. Voices in the hall, unfamiliar ones. Men in suits talking to Mr. Dalton, the owner. I kept my head down as I served tea, but I caught pieces of their conversation. Found near the old bridge. Military background, off record. Dangerous, but hurt. Every word sank like a stone in my stomach. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, staring into the dark fields. My reflection looked tired, older somehow. Then, around midnight, I saw him. He stepped out from between the trees, limping slightly, his coat soaked in mud. For a moment, he just stood there, watching the house like he wasn't sure he was allowed back. Then his eyes met mine through the glass. I didn't think. I went downstairs and opened the door. "You shouldn't have come back," I whispered. He gave a faint, broken smile. "I could say the same to you." He looked worse than before, pale, bruised, exhausted. But his eyes still carried that same quiet command, like he was built to survive even when his body disagreed. "They're looking for you," I said. "I know." He glanced over his shoulder. "That's why I came." I frowned. "You came here to be caught." "No," he said softly. "I came here because I trust you more than them." The words hit harder than they should have. Trust wasn't something people handed me. Not in this house, not in this life. I closed the door behind him. "You have 10 minutes. Then you go." He nodded, sitting heavily on the chair near the window. Fair. As I cleaned the wound reopening on his arm, I noticed how quiet he'd become. No bravado, no orders. Just a man trying not to fall apart. Who are you really? I finally asked. He hesitated. Someone who stopped believing in the right side of things. It wasn't an answer, but it was enough. When I finished bandaging him, he looked up at me, tired, grateful, maybe even afraid. You should leave this place, Claire. Tonight. They'll come here. How do you know? Because I told them not to. I froze. What does that mean? It means, he said, his voice barely above a whisper, I made a deal to keep you out of this. But deals like that don't hold long. He stood slowly, pulling the coat tighter. I could see the tremor in his hand as he reached for the door. If I don't make it out, promise me you won't wait for answers. Just go. Something in me cracked. Not fear, not pity, just the sharp awareness that I was watching a man who had already accepted his ending. I won't promise that, I said quietly. He met my eyes, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. I figured. Then he stepped into the night again. The wind followed him out, cold and final. I stood in the doorway until he disappeared into the dark. For a long time, I couldn't move. Then, slowly, I closed the door and whispered to the empty room. Please don't die out there. But even as I said it, I knew he wouldn't hear. And worse, I wasn't sure I wanted to believe he was gone for good. 2 nights passed before I heard his name. Not from him, but from the men who came looking. They arrived early, before the sun had burned off the morning mist. Black cars lined the gravel path outside the estate, doors opening like silent threats. I watched from the laundry room window as Mr. Dalton greeted them with a stiffness I'd never seen before. His voice was low, strained. Whatever they were discussing wasn't about business. It was about control. I kept folding sheets, pretending I didn't notice. But every word that carried through the walls made my hands shake. Luca Marino. That was the first time I heard it. And the way they said it, careful, respectful, almost afraid, told me everything I needed to know. The man I had helped wasn't just running. He was being hunted. When they left, I stayed in the back corridor, waiting until the house was still again. My chest felt tight, like my ribs couldn't contain what I'd just learned. The most feared man in the city, the one whispered about in corners and late-night bars, had bled on my sheets. And I had kept him alive. I should have been terrified. Instead, I felt something far more dangerous. I felt responsible. That evening, I went out to the edge of the property, to the same spot where I'd last seen him disappear. The air smelled like rain again, that heavy, metallic scent that always seemed to follow him. I didn't expect to find him there. I just needed the silence to make sense of the noise. But he was there. Sitting against a tree, hood pulled low, one arm wrapped around his ribs. He looked worse, paler, thinner, like the world had been taking pieces of him since the night he left. You shouldn't be here, I said. He looked up slowly. Neither should you. His voice had changed, lower, heavier. It wasn't a threat. It was exhaustion shaped into sound. I took a step closer. They came looking. I heard your name. He gave a faint, humorless smile. Then you know enough to walk away. I sat down a few feet from him, ignoring the warning in his tone. You saved my life once, I said quietly. He frowned. When? That night. When you told me to leave. You could have stayed hidden. But you didn't. He shook his head, wincing slightly. I didn't save you, Claire. I saved what's left of me. His words hung between us, too honest to question, too sad to comfort. I looked at him then, really looked. The scars along his hand, the way he scanned every sound, how his breath hitched when he tried to stand. He wasn't invincible. He was human. And that realization frightened me more than the stories ever could. Why here? I asked. Why this house? For a long time, he didn't answer. Then he said, because once, this was mine. I froze. Yours. He nodded, eyes distant. Before the Daltons bought it. My father built half these walls. We lost it when I was a boy, to debts, to bad decisions, to people like them. I guess I came back to see if it still felt like home. I didn't know what to say. There was a tenderness in his voice I hadn't heard before, the kind that doesn't belong to a man feared by others. It belonged to someone who once had something worth losing. He looked toward the mansion, eyes unreadable. They took everything from us, Claire. But I didn't come here for revenge. Not this time. Then why? He hesitated, then met my gaze. To see if there's anything left in me that isn't hate. For a moment, we just sat there, two people caught between what was lost and what shouldn't have been found. Finally, I said, there is. I've seen it. He laughed softly, the sound brittle. You don't know me. I know what you did when you didn't have to, I said. That's enough. He looked down, a faint tremor in his jaw. You shouldn't believe in men like me. Maybe not, I said. But I do. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything we didn't say. He stood slowly, his shadow stretching long across the grass. If they come back, tell them nothing. Not my name, not where I went. I nodded. Where will you go? He looked toward the fading light. Somewhere no one remembers who I was. Before leaving, he turned to me one last time. Thank you, Claire, for treating me like a person when I stopped being one. And then he was gone again, swallowed by the forest, by the night, by the life that kept taking from him. I stayed there until the wind turned cold. His name still echoed in my mind, over and over, until it no longer sounded like a threat. It sounded like a wound. And for the first time since he'd entered my life, I whispered it out loud, not in fear, but in understanding. Luca. It felt human. It felt real. And somehow, it felt like the beginning of something I wasn't ready to name. They said the fire started in the West Wing, a bad wire, a spark, an accident. But accidents don't scream in the middle of the night. I woke to smoke crawling under my door. The air tasted bitter, sharp. I didn't think, I just ran. The hallway was red with reflection, flames licking the old wallpaper, wood cracking like it remembered every sin the house had seen. By the time I reached the servants' staircase, the entire corridor was alive with heat. Mr. Dalton was shouting somewhere, his voice breaking between orders and panic. I should have felt afraid, but what I felt instead was something stranger, déjà vu. Like I had already lost this house once, just like him. I grabbed the emergency bucket, started throwing water against the curtains, but it was pointless. The fire had already decided what it wanted. Through the chaos, a voice cut through the smoke. Deep. Familiar. Claire. I turned. He was there. Luca. He shouldn't have been, not after what he'd promised. But there he was, face streaked with ash, jacket half burned, eyes scanning the room like he was trying to save something that couldn't be saved. What are you doing here? I coughed. He grabbed my arm, pulling me back from a falling beam. Looking for you. You shouldn't. Neither should you, he said, his voice sharp but soft, the kind that hides fear under command. We ran through the hall together, pushing past smoke and falling plaster. Every room we passed burned a little of my past away, the kitchen where I'd learned to stay invisible, the corridor where I'd first found him bleeding. All of it collapsing behind us like it had never mattered. When we reached the back door, I heard shouting outside, the same black cars, the same men. Their flashlights cut through the dark like judgment. Go, Luca said, opening the back path toward the woods. No, I grabbed his wrist. You can't go out there. He looked at me, eyes hard. Claire, this place isn't burning by accident. They did this to draw me out. The realization hit like ice. Then why come back? He exhaled slowly, the firelight flickering across his face. Because they would have killed you too. There was no time to argue. The ceiling cracked above us. He pushed me out through the side door just before it collapsed. The sound was deafening, the kind that makes silence feel like a mercy. We stumbled into the cold air, coughing, shaking. The mansion was a mountain of flame behind us. Every scream, every spark, felt like it was erasing something we'd both pretended not to care about. Luca. He held up a hand. Don't. It's over. But it wasn't. Headlights flared through the smoke, the men in suits closing in. I could see their shapes, their guns glinting, their confidence sharp and practiced. Luca turned to me, his voice barely audible. You need to go, Claire. Now. I won't leave you again. This time, you have to. Something in his eyes changed. Not fear, not anger. Surrender. He pulled something from his coat, a folded piece of paper, edges burned. There's a name on this. Someone who can help you start over. Promise me you'll use it. I shook my head. You're talking like someone who's out of time, he said, his breath catching. Go. I wanted to fight him. To stay. But the truth was, staying would have made everything he'd done meaningless. So I ran. I hid behind the old stone wall near the orchard, heart pounding, hands trembling as light and shadow danced across the grass. I could see him from there, standing tall despite the odds, facing them not like a criminal, but like a man who had already lost everything worth saving. Then the gunfire started. The shots echoed through the night, folding into the sound of the fire. I couldn't tell who fell first, I just knew the world went still right after. When the flames finally began to fade, the mansion was gone. So were the men. And him. I walked back at dawn, barefoot, my clothes soaked in ashen rain. The air smelled of smoke and silence. Where the house once stood, there was only blackened ground and the faint outline of a life that had never really been mine. In the rubble, I found the paper he'd given me, half burned, half whole. Only one word was still readable. Marino. Not a name. A legacy. A curse. A ghost. I sat there for a long time, holding the fragment between my fingers. Somewhere in the ashes, I swear I heard his voice, not calling my name, just breathing. And I realized something then. The fire hadn't just taken him. It had taken the part of me that waited for someone else to decide who I was. When I finally stood, the smoke rose behind me like a farewell. I walked down the dirt path, away from everything that burned, and whispered, "Goodbye, Luca." It didn't sound like loss. It sounded like beginning.